So this is going to be an overview of the terminology you're more likely to use to describe a whole plant and then to describe organs on the plant. So it's a kind of a fast, brief overview of a lot of information. And I'm hoping this is just the jumping off point for a lot of further understanding of how to talk about plants. So nice illustration to begin with. We've got a plant with some compound leaves and some clusters of flowers, otherwise known as inflorescences. We'll get to all of that. So before getting into the terminology of plants, it can be helpful to understand kind of where the boundaries are of things like organs and the terms we're going to use. And if you're coming at this from a familiarity with animals, plants grow in a much different way than animals do. So for example, when you were born, you had your arms, your legs, your toes, your eyes. These features were in place. You were basically a smaller version of your current self. But as plants get started, they produce a small number of organs and they increase the number of organs through their life. So they grow by adding organs. And a couple terms help us to understand this difference in how plants grow. So this growing of multiple organs, increasing in number, is what I'd like to term modular growth. So for example, this is like a indoor houseplant fig tree you might have. And it's growing by adding leaves, by adding stems. And an important part about this is that the leaves are, through the course of this plant's life, pretty much the same. So this is not always true for plants, but it's often true that a larger plant has the same kinds of leaves as a younger plant. Another way to look at that is if you take a deciduous tree, right? It loses its leaves every year, but the next year the leaves are about the same. They're new leaves, different leaves from the previous year, but they're about the same in ways that are useful for identifying that plant. So the shape and other features of these leaves will help you to identify this plant. The other part about plant growth is that it's indeterminate. So that means that basically this plant is limited by the amount of size it can attain over however many years it's able to grow in its lifetime. So plants get bigger. They get bigger by adding organs, but they also just keep getting bigger. Generally speaking, that's not, again, true for all species, but generally if you plant a tree, you'll get a bigger tree every year for as long as that tree can stay alive. So that's indeterminate. And in contrast, we are determinate. A person grows to the size they're going to be around their teenage years, and that's about as big or at least as tall as they're going to be through their lifetime. Not really true for most plants. So here's some definitions there. Indeterminate, growing by adding organs, and modular, referring to organs being about the same. And as I mentioned, this class focusing a lot on identifying plants. That's useful. So if you find a young plant or an old plant, you still be able to identify it to the same species using the important features of how that plant grows and how its individual organs look. Speaking of organs, the term organ in plants has a definition that makes it so that there really aren't that many organs to consider. So if you look at a plant in its vegetative state, so this term vegetative refers to the part of the plant that's not flowering or fruiting, emphasizing again the flowering plants, the angiosperms, but the part of the plant that's not involved in sexual reproduction, that's the vegetative part of the plant. And there are three kinds of vegetative organs, and those are what's written here: the roots, stems, and leaves. For identifying a plant, you're often not really faced with looking at the roots. So most of the time you're identifying a plant, if you can identify it in its vegetative state, you'd be doing that using the stems and leaves, and that's about it. And that's really all you need. And so you can kind of see this fig plant, these are a collection of fig plants of different ages, but they've gotten bigger, but you zoomed in on one branch of this plant, it would look very similar to one branch of any other plant. Another way to look at this as a diagram, if you get down onto the individual level, as far as one shoot at a time, the shoots are growing from their tips, as we'll be able to see here. So some vocabulary words useful for describing plants, talking about shoot and root. So Shoot and root basically break down those vegetative organs that we talked about just before. The root obviously is the root organ system, typically underground, typically useful for anchoring plants, getting nutrients and water. And then the shoot is a collective term referring to stems and leaves. So stem, the narrow cylindrical part, and then the broad photosynthetic part would be the leaves. So altogether, pretty much in this plant, everything above ground is the shoot, and that's made up of individual bits of stem and leaf. As far as how the plant grows, this plant growing in by adding new organs means that the plant is growing from its tips. So if you look at the tip of a stem, you'll often see a bud. So sometimes these buds are actively growing. Sometimes, for example, a woody plant often grows for a season and then produces a dormant bud. So you might see buds that are actively growing and producing new organs. You might see buds that are dormant for most of the year, in fact. But when they grow, they're able to produce new shoots. So what's shown here would be, say, the current year's version of growth, growing out from that location on the main stem, producing a side stem, and with it new leaves here. And the leaves are smaller towards the tip. That indicates that they are younger. So as this is growing, the newer leaves are small, just being formed, and eventually they'll reach their really their final size. So plants can sort of produce organs of a certain size, but then after some time goes by, then they're pretty well fixed in size once the brief growing period is done. Okay, so apical meristem, this one's highlighted here at the tip of the main stem, the shoot apex, and also the other tip is at the tip of the root. So this term apex refers to the top, the tip of the top, but also the tip of the bottom. So apical meristem refers to a growing portion. The meristem is similar to the concept of stem cells. So it's an area that's actively dividing, producing new leaves and new stem at the shoot apex and producing new roots at the root apex. And maybe doodle something for you here. So if you imagine this plant growing over time, you take the same plant as it's first growing, you follow that plant over time, the organs that it made initially are still there. And as the plant grows older, it can produce other organs from the tip. So the main root tip and also these side root tips, might be some further branching in the root tips. Some more time goes on. I'll try to copy what I've drawn before. So as time goes on, these existing organs stay in place and additional organs grow out. So we got some branching here, some new leaves being produced. One way to think about this is basically that the organs that are produced, they firm up over time. So they're growing as delicate young cells initially, but then they get stiffened up with harder tissue, and they have to stay in place. So as this plant gets taller, the plant itself gets taller, but this individual leaf stays at the same place, right? Because this portion of the stem below that leaf is the firm part of the plant at that point. Another way to think about that is if you go to a tree and you mark your initials on the tree. Don't do that, but let's say if you were to damage a tree at your chest level, that damage on the tree would always remain at that level. The tree doesn't stretch out over time or anything like that. All right. So this growth from the tips is called primary growth. Growth in thickness is called secondary growth. So that's the kind of growth that produces thicker stems, also woody stems, and in our largest plants, the woody trunks of trees. As the plant is growing, There are regions we call nodes and internodes. So a node is a region where basically where something comes out of the stem. So this is a node here. And in between that node and the next node is internode. So this brief area here is an internode in between this node and this node. So internode, node, internode, node. And thinking about nodes is useful because at that same location, a leaf is coming out and also a stem is coming out. So these are developmentally related. You'll see the position of this side shoot that's getting formed here is immediately related to the position of that leaf. So this one node tells us where a leaf is and also where the stem, the side stems are going to grow out from. And as we'll see, this patterning, so not just the shape of leaves, but the pattern of when side shoots and leaves are produced, that can be useful for identifying species as well. All right, so zooming in a little bit more, we talked about buds a little bit. So bud at the shoot tip. What it means to be a bud is to have some delicate growing cells at the center. And then in the vegetative buds, these are covered by younger leaves. So this helps them to protect the developing meristem. Also just reflects the development of these leaves. So the youngest leaves are the smallest and they're kind of bent over the top. And the next oldest are still pretty small and bent over the top. And they end up kind of overlapping and covering that delicate shoot meristem because they haven't been inflated to full size yet. And also because they serve a protective function. Root tip a little bit different, not as many, so there's no other organs to be produced, just some root hairs coming off to the side and the older root tissue, and the root is protected by this root cap underground. This other term that's on there, axil, refers to a location, as I mentioned before, that side shoots come out from a location really right above the attachment point of a leaf. So that point, attachment point above a leaf, that location is called an axil. Axil is actually the same word we use in human anatomy. It refers to an armpit, sort of an upside down armpit where the side leaf has a connection point, and there's often a bud there. So you can often see the buds there, and the bud is the potential for some growth to happen. So what's shown here on this diagram is that the older tissue has these side buds growing out into side shoots. So this term shoot, you can refer to the whole above ground part as a shoot. You could refer to this as a, say like a lateral or a side shoot. So just multi-purpose words we got here. So there are a lot of terms for plants morphology, describing how plants grow, what their organs look like. And I'll be honest, there's just a lot of, I think a lot of history to this. If you got all these people from the last 500 years writing and talking about how plants grow, they weren't all thinking in the exact same way. So there's just a lot of terms out there. Some people are very specific. They want to have just the right descriptive term for a particular organ, and other terms are a little more general use. So in this class, I want to introduce you to the general use terms, so shape and other features that are commonly described using a pretty common vocabulary. And then I just want to make you aware that beyond the boundaries of this course, or even a particular resource that you're reading, there's a lot of terms out there. And of course, we live in the internet age, and you can look that information up. So if you had a vocabulary term you wanted to get a little more detail on, I've got a link there. This is one run by Missouri Botanical Garden, and it's pretty intense. So in the A's here, you can see there's some chemical formulas on there. So it's a pretty extensive vocabulary list talking about chromosomes and so on. But there are also some other ones. Let me see one that maybe is a little more generally useful. Here's one, antipetalous, inserted in front of the petals. So you might run into a term like this that's not really a mainstream term, but it might be really useful for whatever you're encountering. Another piece of guidance for this is if you're using say a key or a guidebook, your guidebook should have a glossary. That's pretty standard. The vocabulary differs by author sometimes. Some people have preferred terms they use over what somebody else might use. So in this class, I can't really tell you all the vocabulary or even all the general use vocabulary. You're just going to have to get used to it over practice, over time with practice. And I don't know, some of these make sense over time. Some of them, for myself, I still have to look up some of the vocabulary, just terms that are maybe favored by one person that I don't often use their resource, something like that. All right, so I mentioned vegetative and reproductive. We talked about that before. Vegetative, generally speaking, refers to the leafy part of the plant. So you can see the leafy parts here and leafy parts there, and all these plants in these images have leafy parts and also flowering parts. So the flowering part of the plant is reproductive, specifically sexually reproductive, so involved in fertilization, pollen meeting with ovules, producing seeds. Reproduction also can happen vegetatively, so just keep that in mind. If you're familiar with vegetative reproduction, when I talk about reproductive, I'm talking about sexual reproduction there. And as these images show you, that you can often look at a plant and tell pretty cleanly when the vegetative part of the plant transitions to a reproductive part of the plant. So often you have a plant that transitions at a specific time of year. So we live in a temperate area that's got freezing winters, and during the course of the growing season, they start freezing in the spring and they end freezing in the winter at the end of the year. And in that time, this plant has to get itself out of the ground, produce leaves, do photosynthesis, get energy, and convert that energy into flowers. So it's kind of a yearly process that repeats every year. Typically, the earliest structures are the leaves. Earlier things on a plant are lower down on the stem. So we've got a leafy part of this plant down here. And then at some point, either this plant has enough nutrients accumulated or it gets a signal from the environment to produce flowers. It produces a separate stalk that really only leads to flowers and these small scale leaves here. Similar thing here, except a longer stem. We've got a pretty extensive green photosynthetic portion, but then it kind of culminates in the flowering portion at the tip of these two stems. This one is more of a shrub plant, so this is producing reproductive parts at the ends of a variety of shoots along the sides of that plant. But basically, what I want to highlight by showing you these different colors is that you don't have just sort of random flowers intermixed with leaves. It's a pretty good, clean pattern with how these organs are produced. So if you get familiar with the way that plants grow, it can help you understand where to look for the organs you're interested in, and also just recognize some patterns that'll be useful for identifying species. So we've got some terms referring to the basic form of plants. So some plants are herbaceous. You're probably familiar with herbs, right? So that term herb or herb is a culinary term. We want to just avoid thinking of it strictly in those terms. When we talk about botanically a herbaceous plant, that is a plant that's not woody. So woody is contrasted with herbaceous. So locally, we have woody plants would be our trees and shrubs, as shown on here. And herbaceous plants don't have extensive woody tissue. Maybe the easier way to think about this, and the way I like to emphasize, is in Wisconsin, in our local habitat, when winter comes on, our herbaceous plants die down to the ground. So it doesn't mean that the whole plant dies, but it means that it dies to the ground level. So the freezing air is something that this plant is not adapted to survive, or it kind of plans for the freezing temperature and just gives up on the above ground tissue. It may well be alive underground, so an underground stem or some other structure like a tuber could exist on these herbaceous plants, but the above ground part is dead in the winter. Now our woody plants, we've got shrubs and trees. The definition, the break between those two is a little fuzzy. Some species are, I don't want to say that it's something you couldn't really predict. Some species are definitely shrubs and some species are definitely trees. And obviously a pretty clean distinction shown here. Another thing about shrubs is they often have multiple stems coming out from the ground. So this is a shrubby plant. It's woody. This would have parts above ground that survive the winter. Wood is one of the adaptations that can help plants survive the winter. And then it's able to produce leaves and flowers from those above ground portions in the spring. So shrubs attain relatively small heights, and trees would grow taller, typically with one central trunk to support their height. And then this other term, vine, is not strictly a term that defines something that's herbaceous or woody. We have woody vines and we have herbaceous vines. And that is a growth form that grows by growing up other structures. So typically growing up the trunks of trees, as with the poison ivy. It's a relatively small mass to get to a height above ground because it's growing up something else. Within the category of herbaceous plants, we can look at plants that are perennial and plants that are annual. So an annual plant, the entire plant dies at the end of the year or by the end of the year. Annual plants have a strategy where they put their reproductive emphasis into seed production. So all the individuals are dead in the winter, and that population has to come back from seeds the next year. So that's what it means to be an annual plant. And that's a fine strategy, works out great for a lot of species. Plants that are perennial, they are able to survive underground and come back from that same location in the next year. So some of our early flowering plants, like this trout lily on the right here, these are plants that are perennial, and this is going to come up from the same location year after year. And a small number of species fall a little bit in between these two categories. We have species that are biennial, and those grow for 2 years and then they die. So it's sort of like the same strategy as the annual strategy, where they're accumulating a lot of resources. And for these plants, they've just decided to take 2 years to get their resources together. So for example, this mullein plant here, in the first year of growth, it's leaves only. Those leaves are useful for getting the energy into the root. And then in the second year, they produce this flowering stalk like this. And that's the end of the plant after that flowering activity. So the biennial and the annual strategy involve putting all of their resources into sexual reproduction in the hopes that the seeds they produce are going to make up for that plant and produce a whole lot more. Okay, so as I said, this is for herbaceous plants. Woody plants obviously are perennial. It takes several years to get to a height of a shrub or a tree, and they're adapted to withstand the winter without dying, so good for them. So getting in a little bit more closely on the vegetative part of the plant, there are quite a few terms that describe the hairiness of plants. And I'll be honest, I have a hard time feeling confident in looking at a plant and knowing that I've got the kind of hair that's being described. There's a lot of terms out there. So it's not, in a guidebook, it's not typically as simple as hairy or not hairy. As it shows here, there's a lot of different descriptions here. So pubescent is a term that's commonly used. So things that are pubescent, when humans are pubescent, that's when a lot of hair shows up on them. So pubescent, you can remember that term for the hairiness on a plant. Pubescent or puberulent is kind of a minor version of that. And then all kinds of variation. Tomentose, villous, hirsute has to do with how long individual hairs are, how stiff they are. And like I said, there's a lot of terms there. Typically, there would be a glossary that helps you to identify what's going on with those different terms. And the other term I want you to know is glabrous or glabrous. And that refers to part of the plant that doesn't have any hairs. And that's also very useful. So you can be having, if you're identifying a plant and having a key that asks you to consider whether you have hairs or no hairs, that can be useful in telling two species apart. And I have on here a note that if you are being asked by the key to determine if there are hairs, the keys typically assume that you have access to 10 times magnification. So in this class, when we go in the field, we're going to use a hand lens. And so just kind of a warning or watch out that if you take a glance at a plant and you don't see hairs, doesn't mean they're not there. Take a careful look with magnification and just make very sure that you don't have hairs. And then also in the key, it'll tell you hairs in a particular place. So you can have a plant with hairy leaves, but glabrous pedicels, flower stalks, or something like that. Just make sure you understand what part of the plant is being described as hairy in that moment. So I mentioned the arrangement of organs can be useful for telling species apart. The official term for the arrangement of leaves along the stem is called phyllotaxis. So it's a kind of a Greek origin, phyllo for leaf and taxis for arrangement. And the most basic distinction in phyllotaxis is how many leaves emerge from the same node. So over here in this left block here, we've got alternate phyllotaxis, and alternate means that one leaf comes out at a time, right? So one here, then a little internode, then one here, then an internode, then one here, internode, and so on. And then these are two variations on alternate. So spiral, if you got this in, if you look down from the top, this would have these leaves coming out at different positions, heading out in different directions as you go up the stem. And disticus, the die part of that, refers to the fact that the leaves are coming out on one side or the other. So they're alternate, they go right side, left side, right side, left side, right side. So still alternate phyllotaxis, but also more specifically alternate in this one dimension, basically left or right, or two dimensions. Opposite, in contrast to alternate, this is two leaves coming out per node, and this is a common distinction. So alternate versus opposite can be very helpful for telling your species apart. Two at a time, two at a time, two at a time, two at a time. This term decussate is a kind of opposite phyllotaxis where there's a rotation of about 90 degrees in between one pair of leaves and the next. So it's a little bit hard to show you in the two-dimensional image here, but this one's going at a 90-degree angle to that one. Often we've got some plant families where you can find this pattern, and it also conveys a squareness to the stem. So sometimes, not always, you get a square stem as a result of this, this pattern. So decussate, non-decussate. And then finally, next arrangement of leaves phyllotaxis, known as whorled, is 3 or more leaves per node. So 3 coming out at a time. Relatively rare, typically don't see this, and so having whorled leaves would be helpful for identifying a plant you got. So I'd say if there's one thing you want to notice about an unfamiliar plant, it's probably this would be one of the top 5 things that you want to notice to be able to narrow down what kind of plants you have. So there are plant groups that are only alternate, there are some that are only opposite, and so this can really help you narrow down what group you're looking at there. And then the second bullet point here is another useful feature, that if you have a plant that has some stem branching, particularly useful in a woody plant, you can identify your woody plants in the winter without any leaves if you know how the branches are arranged. So this relates back to what we talked about with axils and axillary side branches, axillary buds. So if this plant has opposite leaves, it's going to produce opposite branches as this plant branches out. So you can identify the pattern of branching would be the same pattern as the pattern of leaf initiation. So speaking of leaves, the leaf is the whole collection of features having to do with the leaf that you're looking at. These are very useful for identifying species as well. And it's important to be able to know the really the boundaries of what constitutes a leaf. So leaf technically is the blade and also the stalk. So when somebody talks about a leaf, I think we want the leaf to be the broad part, but the leaf actually also includes the stalk. So the stalk here is called the petiole, and the broad photosynthetic part is the blade. And so that relates to what we've talked about for phyllotaxis. that where this thing originates from the stem, the whole thing is leaf. So right here is where it leaves the stem. That's part of the leaf. That's part of the leaf. So important to remember when you're talking about leaves to consider that they've got a stalk and also a blade. That's a common shape. It's also possible to have a leaf without a stalk. So if the blade goes right down to the point of attachment on the stem, that would be a leaf that only consists of blade and no stalk. And I think I probably got that on the vocabulary slide. This would be a sessile leaf. So sessile is a term meaning no stalk. All right, there it is on there. So leaves lacking petioles are sessile. And then the other features that are useful to know for your leaves are lobing and compound leaves. So the important difference between a leaf that is lobed, as with this oak, versus a leaf that is compound, like this rose, is that the divisions on a compound leaf go all the way down to a vein. So a leaf blade is kind of a fleshed out, a flattened area around the veins, and a compound leaf has veins that don't have any blade on them in between other such things. So here we've got the base of the leaf, and it's heading out into 1, 2 leaflets, 3, 4, 5 leaflets total on that rose leaf. So technically, that whole thing is a leaf. So a compound leaf you got your stem, would be leaving the leaf. Oh, okay, let's try that again. Let's try it again. Second guessing my leaf structure as I draw it. Yeah, I'll thicken it up a little bit there. Okay, so it's possible for a leaf to have a form like this. And the whole thing is a leaf. This gets back to how leaves are initiated, how the pattern repeats. So just like we saw with the other leaves, if you had a plant with this kind of compound leaf as its leaf, all the leaves along the stem would have the same reproducible pattern. So maybe exactly the same number of leaflets, or maybe a consistent range of leaflets. And I mentioned this term leaflet. So a leaflet is the term for a part of a leaf that is compound. And you can have some terms that refer to how the leaves are compound. So in this example, this is kind of a useful point of consideration that this plant has alternate phyllotaxis because of how we need to define the leaves, right? So the leaves are compound, and as they originate, they're one at a time. If you look at the leaflets on the compound leaf, those leaflets are across from each other. And that actually, the phyllotaxis of leaflets, I don't often see that come up in keys for identifying, but it could be useful. Maybe it'd be described as opposite leaflets there. And then the leaflets here are, I guess you'd call them sessile. So the leaflets don't have stalks, but the leaf itself does in fact have a petiole. So here's a good example of why it's important to be able to describe the right organ at the right place on this plant. You get really thrown if you had the wrong impression of what a leaf was, or what part you were looking at for phyllotaxis. And a question that often comes up, how do I know the difference between a compound leaf and say a side shoot. So I'll try to draw something similar. Let's say we had a side shoot here that's got sessile leaves on it. So you can have something very similar in appearance in two kinds of plants. This is if this one is in fact simple leaves, so simple that are not compound. Then the pattern you see of these leaves being opposite, that would have to be the same pattern you see on stems. So you can't have a separate pattern at two parts of this plant. It would have opposite phyllotaxis throughout. And probably one of the more useful things to look for if you want to know the boundaries of a leaf is where these buds are located. So if you have a compound leaf, there would not be any axils inside of the leaf. So these are leaflets, they don't have their own buds. There's no axillary bud coming from the axil of a leaflet. On a simple plant, you would have axillary buds produced, so sorry, a simple plant, I mean a plant with simple leaves, you would have a pretty broad collection of axillary buds. And then the end of this, if this is a woody plant, a lot of times you'd have a terminal bud as well. So this helps to tell you if there's a bud there, you don't have buds growing out from within a leaf. You would have them growing from axils of individual leaves. And then if you went back in time, these side shoots would have grown out. Let's say this is a deciduous plant, thinking of something like a honeysuckle right now. In a previous year, there would have been leaves there, and these side shoots are the result of the axillary bud of those leaves growing out. So kind of similar form between plant with compound leaves and a plant with simple leaves, and knowing how to define a leaf is pretty useful. Maybe one other thing to consider is if you've got a woody plant or a plant that has deciduous leaves, paying attention to where the leaves fall off can also help you to know where you've got the boundaries of a leaf. Okay. Another feature, one that's shown pretty well on this rose leaf. So again, this is the single leaf. This one's got a couple of flared out bits coming from the base of that leaf. These have a name, they're called stipules. And they can be useful for identifying plants. Some plant groups definitely have stipules, some not so much. And so the presence of stipules can be useful for identifying the plants you've got. Okay, a couple terms, just good to know the terms, technical terms for upper surface and lower surface. We have these terms abaxial and adaxial. And it's a fair consideration. Leaves don't always point upwards to the sun in the same way in every species. And so just knowing how to define upper and lower can be useful. This term abaxial refers to the, well, I want to say the lower surface, but technically, let me define it for us. Oh, there we go. All right, let's see if I can do this in 2 dimensions. So technically, as a leaf is formed, as it's formed, it's kind of pressed up against the stem. And so this surface of the leaf that would have been pressed up against the stem is adaxial. And the ad is toward, and axial is like the axis, the stem here. So ad toward and ab away from. These are Latin prefixes. And somebody must have had fun coming up with those because they're just too similar. Adaxial and abaxial. So toward the stem, away from the stem, those end up in most species becoming, so as this leaf started out next to the stem, might fold out to be more flat, get good sun exposure. So in most leaves, adaxial means upper and abaxial means lower. So on this oak, the shiny part is the adaxial upper surface. The brighter green part is the abaxial lower surface. A feature you can see on both of these is that the veins on the lower surface are more, they kind of stick out like support girders. They do have that role in supporting this broad, flat leaf. And the leaves veins kind of protrude a little bit more from the lower surface. That's pretty common, at least the mid vein is pretty commonly does that. That can help you to find the lower surface. For most plants, again, just upper and lower are pretty consistent with adaxial and abaxial respectively. Or if you want to be the most technical, you would follow the top of this leaf over to here and see that the top of that leaf is in fact the surface of the petiole that's closest to the stem, adaxial. All right, a little bit more about leaves. We got leaf venation. So venation is spelled correctly. I'll lose a couple letters from vein. Venation refers to the arrangement of veins. So three big types of venation you can find in leaves: pinnate, palmate, and parallel. And pinnate comes from the word for feather. So pinnate is like a feather, and ends up looking, there we are. So we got one main vein in the middle. The mid vein is very commonly a feature of leaves. And the secondary veins, the next biggest veins, come out along the mid vein. So that makes it pinnate, one main vein in the middle. Palmate has its major veins branching right at the base of the blade. So petiole, and then at the blade, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 veins, all kind of similar, equal in size. So they're getting considered as primary veins, and they're all coming out from the base of this leaf. Palmate, if you want to think about palmate, you can think about the palm of your hand. So palm of your hand, all the fingers trace back to the same location on a hand. So all going back to the same base of this leaf. Pretty useful distinction. Not every plant has veins you can see very easily, but if you can, this is a good distinction to know. And then this third category, as we'll see, is often found in monocots, so a different group of plants than the majority group of plants. Parallel veins where they run next to each other for most of the length. So they do kind of pinch together at the base or at the tip, but for most of the length, they're running next to each other as parallel veins. So we mentioned compound leaves. Compound leaves can use some of the same terminology. You can have pinnately compound leaves. So if we've determined this is compound, then having this have its leaflets come out along the length, along this mid vein, that would make it pinnately compound. Palmately compound, leaflets heading back to the same location. This is relatively rare, much more common, I'd say, to find pinnately compound leaves. Or maybe the most common is this kind, trifoliolate. So the tri there is 3 leaflets. And if you got 3, you can't quite say whether they're palmate or pinnate. They're features in common with both. So we just give them their own category of trifoliolate. And then on the right, sometimes we have plants that have much more like different orders of being compound. This is one leaf of a Kentucky coffee tree. And it has mid vein and then side veins that are not leaflets, but they're then divided into leaflets. So this is divided a couple times and it gets this term bipinnate. So by the time you get down to a single leaflet, you're on the second order branching at that point. Leaf shape, lots of terminology here, including, I've got this term cordate on here. This is one you don't typically run into, but I wanted to use that as an example that there are lots of kind of just niche terms for leaf shape sometimes. So I want to introduce you to the broad shapes as shown in the diagram at the right. So linear, straight and skinny, pretty much. Elliptic. I want to call attention to the difference between elliptic and ovate. So people a lot of times I think would refer to this as an oval. And in botany, we don't like to do that. So oval comes from the word for egg, an ovum. And so oval is more like egg-shaped. And eggs, chicken eggs, are fat on one side and skinnier on the other. So the fattest part of this leaf, this ovate leaf, is toward the base of that leaf. The fattest part of the elliptic leaf is at the middle. So elliptic is symmetrical in 2 dimensions. Ovate is asymmetrical in this dimension, fatter towards the base. Ovate is related to lanceolate. It's kind of a judgment call. Leaves that are more broad are ovate, leaves that are skinnier are lanceolate. And there's this prefix ob, which I just think of as meaning upside down. So oblanceolate is an upside down lanceolate leaf attached at the bottom here. So skinnier at the base, fattest toward the tip. Obovate, skinny at the base, fattest toward the tip. A couple other examples, orbicular, so perfectly circular leaf blade, spatulate, kind of tapering to a fat paddle-like at the end. So overall shape is what we talked about on the previous slide. This is a slide showing angles, so you can describe the angle of the base and the angle of the tip of the leaf. And useful terms, acute and obtuse. So those have to do with being less than 90 degrees. So a narrow angle is acute and greater than 90 degrees is obtuse. So we've got a obtuse angle here at the base of this leaf, an acute angle here at the base of this leaf, acute tip there. Also some other terms you might encounter referring to tapering leaves or leaves with lobes at the base or something. Leaf margin can be smooth or toothed, and teeth of different sizes. So finely toothed versus a little more broadly toothed. The terms serrate and dentate are similar. Serrate refers to teeth that are angled off to the side, and dentate teeth go straight out, kind of perpendicular from the margin. There also are terms called cerulate or denticulate. Just draw one of them in here. Cerulate is a diminutive term, and that would be one that's got fine teeth versus serrate would have maybe bigger teeth. And again, so to be useful in an identification key, these terms should be very clearly different from the other kinds. So serrate versus entire is pretty easy to tell. Serrate versus cerulate, that would be something you might need to describe in more detail, say the number of teeth per centimeter or something. All right, I think I'm gonna stop with this one and pick up with a new presentation for the reproductive growth of these plants.